Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Race and the New Deal. And we're going to talk about 5 things that, as you read more about the African American experience when it comes to life in America in the 1930s and during the time period of the Great Depression, it's good to think about these terms and kind of key in on them as a way to get started, because it's a complex era and there's a lot to get through. So let's dig into it. So the first thing for us to note is just New Deals. So 1932, early 1933, Franklin Roosevelt's going to be elected President of the United States. There will be ultimately at least 2 New Deals, one that he and his administration attempts beginning in 1933, and then another that is attempted on the eve of the 1936 elections, so 1935, 36, and 37. So it's important when we're talking about the New Deal to kind of think that what we mean generally is this activist era under the first 2 kind of FDR administrations, especially the first, but certainly at the end of the first and into the second as well. That brings us to our second point, New Deal coalition. So by the time you get to the early 1930s, most Black Americans, because of the nature of Jim Crow systems of both institutional discrimination, so you got your de facto and your de jure, you got your institutional, and you've got your sort of culture of white supremacy that is being sort of enabled as well. Most Black Americans, especially across the American South, are, of course, functionally prohibited from voting, and less than something like 10% or so approximately are registered to vote. But those who can, those who do, in 1932 largely are going to shift their voting interest. And in 1932, many Black Americans will shift and vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party in 1932. Typically, in the aftermath of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as Black men had taken up suffrage and voting and voted where they could, many had voted for the Republican Party. That process in 32 is going to shift. The Great Depression has a lot to do with that. Remember, generally, when we're talking about the Great Depression, by the time we get to 32, 33, figures, they vary, but it's something, of course, it's usually the figures around 25% to about a third of Americans just overall are out of work. More recent scholarship says that number is fairly low, that if you think of the idea of those who are not only unemployed but underemployed, that you're looking at least half the country in that time period. So Roosevelt's call to a New Deal for all Americans, that idea that all are going to be a part of this, was a big deal. Now, the sad reality, of course, is that even though Black Americans will vote overwhelmingly for the Democrats in 1932, that the Roosevelt administration, and particularly the southern wing of the Democratic Party, would often find common cause with many who sought to kind of uphold the system of Jim Crow and maintain white supremacy. That brings us to our third point, which is the AAA. Now, this is not the AAA auto thing. This is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So there's quite a lot of legislation that the New Deal era brings in. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was one of these pieces. You have quite a high percentage of Americans who live and work on farms in 1933. And so the idea is direct payments, subsidy payments to farmers, with the understanding that can help to provide some immediate relief to the difficult conditions that existed within America's farming communities. The functional result of that, though, sadly, was that those payments often went to farm owners, and they don't necessarily pass those on to farm workers. And in many parts of the American South, the Deep South at that point, in a lot of sharecropping situations. You have a number of black Americans who are working that land and had been doing so for generations, and of course those payments will be denied to them. Now, the AAA will eventually be declared unconstitutional, but the concept of farm subsidies, of course, is something that we still have today. That brings us to our fourth point: Social Security Act and minimum wage. So, as a part of the era of the Second New Deal and afterwards, so if the first New Deal was kind of trying to provide immediate relief, jobs programs, shoring up the system, right? 1935 and after, so 1938 for minimum wage, a lot of that's kind of reshaping the system. And the Social Security Act, right, this idea that you're going to be able to put money away, right, the government's going to take money for you and give you a pension when you retire, right, this was seen as quite an innovative thing. And then the idea that the federal government's going to mandate that there's a precise minimum wage that you're supposed to get, right, these are going to be things that are seen as fundamentally, for many in the Democratic Party, seen as fundamentally good things. The difficulty, though, is that for many African Americans, given the nature of the employment situations that many had at the time, which was partly due to the idea that these were the only things that would be considered acceptable on the part of many whites, their position with the Social Security Act and minimum wage were denied. Of course, for many farm workers, farm laborers, they're not necessarily going to get to take Social Security. For many who worked in domestic service, and countless black women have that position in the 1930s and early 1940s. Same thing. And then when it comes to, of course, minimum wage, if we look at the discussions of why there's a difference in terms of minimum wage, which some of you watching this may know full well, the differences in minimum wage between, say, an industrial or warehouse job versus, say, working in a restaurant. Those who tended to work in those kinds of restaurant service industries were often at that time non-white individuals. And so, of course, for those who are writing the laws, connotations were made in terms of race. As a direct result, you have a difference in terms of minimum wages that reflected the racialized realities of the late 1930s. This brings us to our fifth point, which is marching on Washington, or the March on Washington. So 1940, 1941, the nation is still kind of struggling through the last gasps of the Depression. The Second World War has gotten going, and the federal government has begun approving Lend-Lease and a number of other things to provide assistance to some of our allies before Pearl Harbor. There was an active effort on the part of many black leaders in terms of labor and elsewhere to make it clear to the federal government that with all of these contracts being sort of set about, that there needed to be a direct effort to attempt to combat discrimination in these workplaces. And so this was partly where we see the March on Washington and A. Philip Randolph's support for this. Now, this doesn't ultimately occur due to a variety of reasons, but the functional result, at least in the moment, was Roosevelt's enactment of the Executive Order 8802, and of course the creation of something called the FEPC, or the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Now, that commission and its power during the Second World War to legislate against certain industries that continued segregation was relatively limited in some cases, but if anything, the federal government at least wanted to be seen as being opposed to measures of segregation. All right. Thank you very much.